Thank you for inviting me to present in this very interesting session. I'm going to be talking about a collaboration between EDC and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography that was funded by the National Science Foundation. This collaboration grew out of a series of conversations with Cheryl Peach of Scripps. During these conversations, we realized we're in the middle of a paradigm shift in how we observe Earth systems, to one in which vast amounts of data are being collected continuously and automatically, and which, via emerging cyber infrastructure, are available to just about anyone who has the ability to find and access them. So not only is this transforming the way science is done, it also has the potential to change in dramatic ways how science is taught. This could bring tremendous opportunities to students to examine the evidence behind important scientific ideas and to conduct scientific investigations that were never before possible in the classroom. However, bringing these authentic data into the classroom poses significant challenges. Remotely collected data. These data are collected remotely and from potentially unfamiliar locations using unfamiliar instruments, and most student work with data to date have been with data they collected themselves. This means that students are unlikely to understand well what the data actually represent, and things such as data limitations and data quality issues and so forth. Also, they're large and complex data sets, and this defies what students are typically taught in science classes about controlling variables. You can't. For novices unfamiliar and inexperienced with the knowledge domain, working with these complex data sets can be really difficult and require significant scaffolding. And I would note that in the age of big data, this type of work with complex data sets is becoming extremely important for the future workforce. And there are significant issues regarding the usability of the data access portals and the data representations that exist for expert use. And when we looked for studies that described how to design student-friendly data interfaces and data analysis tools, we found that there was no coherent guidance about how to do this. However, there was relevant information in a broad variety of disciplines. So we felt it would be an important contribution to the field to gather this relevant knowledge and make it useful to educational interface developers or whoever else is interested. NSF agreed, and they funded EDC and Scripps to do this knowledge gathering. To gather relevant knowledge, we reviewed over 200 articles from these journals and others. Also, we reviewed workshop proceedings and internet-published articles, PowerPoints, etc., and books with people with expertise. And I've listed the journal names because they illustrate just how diverse our sources were. This meant we had to learn domain-specific vocabulary and become familiar with bodies of work sometimes built up over, many decades and divergent fields. It was a challenge, a really interesting challenge, but it was definitely a challenge. We also worked with an august and diverse group of experts from various areas of relevance to our work. We had some really, really interesting and productive meetings about this, and we had our resulting report also reviewed by several cognitive scientists, including Jess Gropin of EDC and Tim Shipley of Temple. And this is what we learned. We learned that what an expert sees on a data access page or in a data visualization will not be what a novice sees, literally. And this is because our visual perception system is really information processing. It's not about capturing pictures in the head. And the amount of information in the environment, and that's what we were trying to represent on the bottom of this diagram, the amount of information in the environment is much greater than what actually ends up in our mental image. And that mental image for an expert is going to be quite different from that of a novice, and we'll try to explain why that is. When light strikes your retina, it registers as perceived differences in light level and wavelength and spatial position. So these perceived differences in light level and spatial perception and so forth register as a rough sketch of spatial properties, form, and movement. And so far, all of this happens more or less automatically, and the filtering and reduction of information has already begun. And that's because we only notice a small portion of what's in the environment. We only see clearly in the center of our vision. We have the illusion of a full view, however, because we sample what's in our peripheral vision with rapid eye movements, and our brain knits it together into fooling us into perceiving this as a complete image. And we sample only what captures our attention, so that means we miss a lot. Then, using our short-term memory, we take the information we've perceived and match it up with and map it onto our existing knowledge structures, identifying the features and interpreting and extracting meaning. And we store the new knowledge that we've built, the new in this new or revised mental image, or what's known as a schema, in our long-term memory. So there's a big difference between what ends up in an expert's mental image versus a novice's, and here's why. The sophisticated schema or mental images that experts have stored and encoded in their long-term memory significantly bump up the amount of information that they take in at every step of this process. So first of all, experts will take in more information automatically because they recognize things that novices don't. For example, a map of sea surface temperature. Novices who don't have relevant schema are going to rely more heavily on what our visual perception system is predisposed to notice. And that means it's critical to understand this when designing data visualizations for novice users. And then the short-term memory is a really critical bottleneck. It's basically what we're able to hold in our attention at any particular time. Our long-term memory, on the other hand, is virtually unlimited in capacity. Experts have more sophisticated schema and mental models stored in their long-term memory, and they don't need to devote those precious short-term memory resources to thinking about these things. They can simply build on them. But our short-term memory is what we use to build more sophisticated schema. It's what we use to learn things. Therefore, it's critical to design data interfaces, visualizations, and tools that are intended for student novice use very intentionally to make the best possible use of students' short-term memory resources. So we can't change the overall amount of information we can work with in our short-term memory, but we can change the types of things we are engaged with. Cognitive scientists refer to 3 types of cognitive load that place demands on our short-term memory. There's a certain amount of cognitive load that's intrinsic to any particular thinking task or area, and you can't do a lot about that. For example, climate science is simply complicated. And there's cognitive load that engages your short-term memory but isn't relevant or germane to your learning goals. That's the extraneous cognitive load. And the germane cognitive load refers to the portion of your short-term memory that's engaged in thinking that's relevant to your learning goals. To maximize learning, it's critical to maximize the degree to which short-term memory is engaged in the germane cognitive load associated with a learning experience. And I have to put an important caveat in there, and that is that what's germane to one student may be extraneous to another. So the Visualizing Oceans of Data report that resulted from this project has cross-cutting guidelines and over 70 specific guidelines about designing data access portals and data visualizations for educational use. I'm only going to describe a few relevant to the design of a few of them in this. And one of them is that accessing and visualizing data should be fast and easy. Now this is a typical expert data interface, and it'll stop most novice students and teachers cold. There should be low to no barriers to downloading and visualizing a data set. You want to get students right to the data. You want to minimize expert terminology and automate processes that are not important to the learning goals. Include information to minimize confusion. Students don't have experience with maps, such as this map of sea surface temperature. They have difficulty identifying what they're looking at, where it is, the scale, what the color means, and so on. And when you zoom in, it can be disorienting. I'm actually guessing that some of you are having difficulty understanding where this is. It's in the Atlantic, off the coast of Canada and New England. And it's also fairly common to get confused about which is the land and which is the ocean. The white is the land. A few orienting labels would make a huge difference on this visualization. It's also important to make the important information stand out, and the color palette that's applied can make a big difference along these lines. And there's a whole lot known about this. It's really interesting. This sea surface temperature map was generated using the common default spectral color palette. Our visual perception system evolved to use color hue to pick out ripe berries in a bush, not to discern shape or form or find detail. The second image displays exactly the same data using a different color palette. So the one on the left calls strong attention to the temperature transition along the northern edge of the Gulf Stream, where you see the red and then the yellow rim. The one on the right highlights the more fine details in this temperature transition, and that's because the color palette shifted to display this transition zone in the green to blue range, which is more perceptually gradational to our visual perception system. So the key is this: you've got to remember that novice perceptions of a data visualization are going to be more strongly influenced by our basic evolutionary tendencies. And so you need to pay particularly close attention to the color palette you use to display the data and make sure it makes the information stand out that you want to stand out. And if you give color palette options to students, you should label them so that they can make appropriate choices about which ones to use. This visualization of an elephant seal track superimposed on bathymetry successfully employs several design elements. The high contrast between the animal track and the bathymetry data layer makes it stand out clearly to our eyes. Also, it's really interesting how these subtle bathymetric features are conveyed through variations in luminance, not differences in color hue, but variations in the luminance of the light from almost black to light blue, very light blue. Now, when designing data access and analysis tools for student use, it's critical to understand what your learning goals are and automate the processes that are not important to these goals. So the last thing I'm going to show you is a quick sequence of screenshots from our Ocean Tracks beta interface, which we're constructing based on Oceans of Data guidelines. This is a collaboration with Stanford's Hopkins Marine Station, and what we're doing is we're providing access to data from satellite-tagged marine animals, along with physical oceanographic data. Our goal has been to develop an interface that gets students quickly to the data and provides them with tools that allow them to interact with the data as scientists do. The interface takes students, first of all, directly to an interactive Google Map view of the Pacific, which we found is pretty familiar to students. So students are able to easily turn on and off tracks, such as these elephant seal tracks and great white shark tracks, which are turning on. That's the great white shark, and then the elephant seal tracks will come up shortly. We've also provided a tool that it'll show you that allows students to focus on a particular track and dynamically graph certain parameters. For example, this elephant seal's deepest daily dive. They can also look at the speed, the curviness, and so forth. And we also give them the tools to overlay time-coordinated maps of sea surface temperature, chlorophyll currents, and human impacts. So we pilot tested this in classrooms last spring and this fall and have promising indications that the interface is encouraging students to engage with the data in the ways that we had hoped, and we're continuing to work on this. We're hoping in a Phase 2 grant that we've applied for. So our guidelines, along with a discussion of the key underpinnings of these guidelines and recommendations for future research, are presented in our Knowledge Status Report, Visualizing Oceans of Data, Educational Interface Design. If you're interested in getting a copy of this, please contact me or Cheryl Peach at these email addresses, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.